The High Priestess wears a 3-layered tiara and holds an open book. The tiara is laden with precious stones, which suggests the idea that it is by way of 3 stages that the crystallization of the pure act descends through the 3 higher and invisible planes before arriving at the 4th stage, the book. For the problems that the symbol implies are reflection, memory, word, and writing, or in other words, revelation and tradition, spoken and written, or to express it in a single word, Gnosis. This is also the title given by Eliphas Levi as a heading for the 2nd chapter of his Transcendental Magic, its Doctrine and Ritual. It is concerned with Gnosis and not at all with science, since Gnosis is exactly what the card of the High Priestess expresses, both in its entirety and in its details, namely the descent of revelation, the pure act or essence reflected by substance, down to the final stage or book. Science, on the contrary, begins with facts, the characters of the book of nature, and ascends from facts to laws and from laws to principles. Gnosis is the reflection of that which is above. Science, in contrast, is the interpretation of that which is below. The last stage of Gnosis is the world of facts, where it becomes fact itself, i.e. it becomes book. The first stage of science is the world of facts, which it reads in order to arrive at laws and principles. As it is Gnosis, i.e. mysticism, become conscious of itself, that the card symbolizes, it does not present the image of a scientist or a doctor, but rather that of a priestess, the High Priestess, the sacred guardian of the Book of Revelation. As the High Priestess represents the stages of the descent of revelation, from the small uppermost circle on her tiara as far as the open book on her knees, her position is in keeping with this. She is seated. For to be seated signifies a relationship between the vertical and horizontal, which corresponds to the task of the outward projection, horizontal, book, of the descending revelation, vertical, tiara. This position indicates the practical method of Gnosis, just as the standing magician indicates the practical method of mysticism. The magician dares, for this reason he is standing. The High Priestess knows, this is why she is seated. The transformation from to dare to know consists in the change of position from that of the magician to that of the High Priestess. The essence of pure mysticism is creative activity. One becomes a mystic when one dares to elevate oneself, i.e. to stand upright, then even more upright and ever more upright, beyond all created being as far as the essence of being, the divine creative fire. Concentration without effort is burning without smoke or crackling fire. On the part of the human being, it is the act of daring to aspire to the supreme reality, and this act is real and effective only when the soul is serene and the body completely relaxed, without smoke and crackling fire. The essence of pure Gnosis is reflected mysticism. Gnosis signifies that which takes place in mysticism has become higher knowledge. That is, Gnosis is mysticism which has become conscious of itself. It is mystical experience transformed into higher knowledge. Now, this transformation of mystical experience into knowledge takes place in stages. The first is the pure reflection or a kind of imaginative repetition of the experience. The second stage is its entrance into memory. The third stage is its assimilation in thought and feeling in a manner where it becomes a message or inner word. The fourth stage, lastly, is reached when it becomes a communicable symbol or writing, or book, i.e. when it is formulated. The pure reflection of mystical experience is without image and without word. It is purely movement. Here consciousness is moved by the immediate contact with that which transcends it, with the trans-subjective. This experience is as certain as the experience belonging to the sense of touch in the physical world, and is at the same time as much devoid of form, colour and sound as the sense of touch. For this reason one can compare it with this sense and designate it as spiritual touch or intuition. This designation is not quite adequate, but at least it has the merit of expressing the character of immediate contact, which is peculiar to the first stage of reflection of the mystical act. Here, mystical experience and Gnosis are still inseparable and are as one. If we want to establish the relationship between, on the one hand, this state of consciousness and the three states which follow it, and on the other hand, the sacred name YHVH, abbreviated YHVH, which is the summation of Jewish Gnosis, or the whole Kabbalah, we cannot do otherwise than to attribute it to the first letter, Yod. The letter Yod is a point with the tendency of the indicated projection. This corresponds admirably to the experience of spiritual touch, which also is nothing other than a point signifying germinally within itself a world of potentialities. Spiritual touch, or intuition, is that which permits contact between our consciousness and the world of pure mystical experience. It is by virtue of this that there exists in the world and in the history of mankind a real relationship between the living soul and the living God, which is true religion. Mysticism is the source and the root of all religion. Without it, religion and the entire spiritual life of humanity would be only a code of laws regulating human thought and action. If God signifies for man something more than an abstract notion, it is thanks to spiritual touch or mysticism. It is the seed of all religious life, with its theology, rituals, and practices. Mysticism is also the seed of Gnosis, which is esoteric theology. Just as magic is esoteric art and occultism or Hermeticism is esoteric philosophy. Now, mysticism is the Yod of the tetragrammaton, just as Gnosis is the first He, magic is the vow or child of mysticism and Gnosis, and Hermetic philosophy is the second final He, i.e. the summation of what is revealed. The last He, or Hermetic philosophy, is the book which the priestess holds on her knees, whilst the three layers of her tiara represent the stages of the descent of revelation from the mystical plane to the Gnostic plane, then from the Gnostic plane to the magical plane, and lastly from the magical plane to the philosophical plane, to the plane of the book or the doctrine. Just as spiritual touch is the mystical sense, so there is a Gnostic sense, a magical sense, and a special Hermetic philosophical sense. Full consciousness of the sacred name YHVH can only be attained by the united experience of these four senses and the practice of four different methods. For the fundamental thesis of Hermetic Epistemology, or Gnoseology, is that each object of knowledge demands a method of knowledge which is proper to it. This thesis or rule signifies that one ought never to apply the same method of knowledge on different planes, but only to different objects belonging to the same plane. A crying example of ignorance of this law is cybernetic psychology, which wants to explain man and his psychic life by mechanical, material laws. Each mode of experience and knowledge, when pushed to its limit, becomes a sense, or engenders a special sense. He who dares to aspire to the experience of the unique essence of being will develop the mystical sense or spiritual touch. If he wants not only to live, but also to learn to understand what he lives through, he will develop the Gnostic sense. And if he wants to put into practice what he has understood from mystical experience, he will develop the magical sense. If, lastly, he wants all that he has experienced, understood, and practiced to be not limited to himself and his time, but to become communicable to others and to be transmitted to future generations, he must develop the Hermetic philosophical sense, and in practicing it he will write his book. Such is the law that YHVH expresses concerning the process of transformation of mystical experience into tradition. Such is the law of the birth of tradition. Its source is mystical experience. One cannot be a Gnostic or a magician or a Hermetic philosopher or occultist without being a mystic. The tradition is a living one only when it constitutes a complete organism, when it is the result of the union of mysticism, gnosis, magic, and Hermetic philosophy. If this is not so, it decays and dies. And the death of the tradition manifests itself in the degeneration of its constituent elements, which become separated. Then Hermetic philosophy, separated from magic, Gnosis and mysticism becomes a parasitic system of autonomous thought, which is, truth to tell, a veritable psychopathological complex, because it bewitches or enslaves human consciousness and deprives it of its liberty. A person who has had the misfortune to fall victim to the spell of a philosophical system, and the spells of sorcerers are mere trifles in comparison to the disastrous effect of the spell of a philosophical system, can no longer see the world or people or historic events as they are. He sees everything only through the distorting prism of the system by which he is possessed. Thus, a Marxist of today is incapable of seeing anything else in the history of mankind other than the class struggle. What I am saying concerning mysticism, gnosis, magic and philosophy would be considered by him only as a ruse on the part of the bourgeois class, with the aim of screening with a mystical and idealistic haze the reality of the exploitation of the proletariat by the bourgeois. Although I have not inherited anything from my parents, and I have not experienced a single day without having to earn my living by means of work recognized as legitimate by Marxists. Another contemporary example of possession by a system is Freudianism. A man possessed by this system will see in everything that I have written only the expression of suppressed libido, which seeks and finds release in this manner. It would therefore be the lack of sexual fulfillment which has driven me to occupy myself with the tarot and to write about it. Is there any need for further examples? Is it still necessary to cite the Hegelians with their distortion of the history of humanity, the scholastic realists of the Middle Ages with the Inquisition, the rationalists of the 18th century who were blinded by the light of their own autonomous reasoning? Yes, autonomous philosophical systems separated from the living body of tradition are parasitic structures which seize the thought, feeling, and finally the will of human beings. In fact, they play a role comparable to the psychopathological complexes of neurosis or other psychic maladies of obsession. Their physical analogy is cancer. With respect to autonomous magic, i.e. magic without mysticism and without gnosis, it necessarily degenerates into sorcery, or at least into a pathological romantic aestheticism. There is no black magic, but rather sorcerers groping in the dark. They grope in the dark because the light of gnosis and mysticism is lacking. Gnosis without mystical experience is sterility itself. It is just a religious ghost without life or movement. It is the corpse of religion, animated intellectually by means of scraps fallen from the table of the past history of humanity. A universal Gnostic church, good Lord, what can one say, what should be said when one has a knowledge, however limited, of the laws of spiritual life governing all tradition? Passing on to mysticism, which has not given birth to gnosis, magic, and hermetic philosophy, such a mysticism must, sooner or later, necessarily degenerate into spiritual enjoyment or intoxication. The mystic who wants only the experience of mystical states without understanding them, without drawing practical conclusions from them for life, and without wanting to be useful to others, who forgets everyone and everything in order to enjoy the mystical experience, can be compared to a spiritual drunkard. So tradition can only live, as with all other living organisms, when it is a complete organism of mysticism, gnosis, and effective magic, which manifests itself outwardly as Hermetic philosophy. This means to say simply that a tradition cannot live unless the whole human being lives through it, in it and for it. For the whole human being is at one and the same time a mystic, a Gnostic, a magician, and a philosopher, i.e. he is religious, contemplative, artistic, and intelligent. Everyone believes in something, understands something, is capable of something, and thinks something. It is human nature which determines whether a tradition will live or die. And it is also human nature which is capable of giving birth to a complete tradition and keeping it living. Because the four senses, mystical, Gnostic, magical, and philosophical, exist, be it in potentiality or in actuality, in each human being. Now, the practical teaching of the second arcanum, the High Priestess, relates to the development of the Gnostic sense. What is the Gnostic sense? It is the contemplative sense. Contemplation, which follows on from concentration and meditation, commences the very moment the discursive and logical thought is suspended. Discursive thought is satisfied when it arrives at a well-founded conclusion. Now, this conclusion is the point of departure for contemplation. It fathoms the profundity of this conclusion at which discursive thought arrives. Contemplation discovers a world within that which discursive thought simply verifies as true. The Gnostic sense begins to operate when it is a matter of new dimension in the act of knowledge, namely that of depth. It becomes active when it is a question of something deeper than the question, is it true or false? It perceives more the significance of the truth discovered by discursive thought, and also why this truth is true in itself, i.e. it reaches to the mystical or essential source of this truth. How does it arrive at this? By listening in silence. It is as if one wanted to recall something forgotten. Consciousness listens in silence as one listens inwardly in order to call to mind from the night of forgetfulness something that one formerly knew. But there is an essential difference between the listening silence of contemplation and the silence arising from the effort to recall. In this second situation it is the horizontal, in time past and present, which comes into play, whilst the listening silence of contemplation relates to the vertical, to that which is above and that which is below. In the act of recall, one establishes in oneself an inner mirror in order to reflect the past. When one listens in silence, in the state of contemplation, one also makes consciousness into a mirror, but this mirror has the task of reflecting that which is above. It is the act of recall in the vertical. There are, in fact, two types of memory: horizontal memory, which renders the past present, and vertical memory, which renders that which is above as present below, or, according to our distinction between the two categories of symbolism which were identified in the first letter, the mythological memory and the typological memory. Henry Bergson is perfectly right when he writes of horizontal or mythological memory. Quote, "The truth is that memory does not consist in a regression from the present to the past, but on the contrary in a progress from the past to the present." Henry Bergson, Matter and Memory, page 319. And also, quote, "Pure memory is a spiritual manifestation. With memory we are in very truth in the domain of the spirit." Page 320. It is therefore the past which comes to us in the remembrance, and this is why the act of recollection is preceded by a state of empty silence which plays the role of a mirror, where the past can be reflected, or, according to Bergson, where, quote, "the state of the brain continues the remembrance. It gives it a hold on the present by the materiality which it, acting as a mirror, confers upon it." Page 320. It is the same again for vertical or typological memory. Plato is also perfectly right when he says of the memory of the transcendent self, which can confer reminiscence upon the empirical self, quote, "Seeing that the soul is immortal and has been born many times, and has beheld all things both in this world and in the nether realms, she has acquired knowledge of all and everything. Thus it would seem research and learning are wholly recollection." Plato, Menon, page 303. Here, likewise, that which is above, in the domain of the transcendent self, descends to the plane of the empirical self, when there is created in oneself the empty silence which serves to mirror the revelation from above. What is necessary, therefore, in order to attain here in the realm of the state of waking consciousness the reflection of that which is above in the mystical domain? It is necessary to be seated, i.e. to establish an active-passive state of consciousness, or state of soul which listens attentively in silence. It is necessary to be woman, i.e. to be in the state of silent expectation, and not in that of the activity which talks. It is necessary to cover with a veil the intermediate planes between the plane whose reflection is expected and the plane of the state of waking consciousness where the reflection becomes actualized. It is necessary to cover the head with a three-layered tiara, i.e. to apply oneself to a problem or question of such gravity that it bears upon the three worlds and on that which is above. Lastly, it is necessary to have one's eyes turned towards the open book on the knees, i.e. to carry out a complete psychurgical operation in the aim of objectifying one's results, i.e. the aim of continuing the book of the tradition, adding something to it. Now, all these practical rules of Gnosis are found clearly indicated in the card, the High Priestess. Here is a woman, she is seated, she wears a three-layered tiara, a veil is suspended above her head to cover the intermediate planes that she does not want to perceive, and she is looking at an open book on her knees. The Gnostic sense is therefore spiritual hearing, just as the mystical sense is spiritual touch. This does not mean to say that the Gnostic sense perceives sounds, but only that its perceptions are due to a consciousness analogous to that in the attitude of expectation and attention when one listens, and that the contact between the perceiver and the perceived is not so immediate as in spiritual touch or mystical experience. It still remains to characterize the two other senses mentioned above, namely the magical sense and the Hermetic philosophical sense. The magical sense is that of projection, whilst the Hermetic philosophical sense is that of synthesis. By projection is meant to put outwards, followed by detaching from oneself the contents of the inner life, an operation similar to that which is produced on the psychic plane in artistic creation and on the physical plane in giving birth. The talent of the artist consists in this, that he can render objective, or project, his ideas and feelings so as to obtain a more profound effect on others than that of the expression of ideas and feelings by a person who is not an artist. A work of art is endowed with a life of its own. When a woman gives birth to a child, she gives birth to a being endowed with a life of its own, which detaches itself from her organism in order to start an independent existence. The magical sense also consists in the faculty of projecting outwards the contents of the inner life, which remain endowed with a life of their own. Magic, art, and giving birth are essentially analogous, and pertain to the same category of projection or exteriorization of the inner life. The church dogma of the creation of the world ex nihilo, i.e. the projection from nothingness of forms and matter which are conferred with a life of their own, signifies the divine and cosmic crowning of this series of analogies. The doctrine of creation ex nihilo is the apotheosis of magic. Its essential statement is, in fact, that the world is a magical act. In contrast, pantheistic, emanationist, and demiurgic doctrines deprive creation of its magical sense. Pantheism denies the independent existence of creatures. They live only as parts of the divine life, and the world is only the body of God. Emanationism attributes only a transitory and therefore ephemeral existence to creatures and the world. Demiurgism declares that ex nihilo nihil, out of nothing comes nothing, and teaches that there must exist a substance co-eternal with God, which God uses as material for his work of craftsmanship. God is therefore not the creator or magical author of the world, but only its craftsman. He only forms, i.e. regroups and recombines, the material elements which are given to him. Here it is not a matter of considering the doctrine of creation ex nihilo as the only explanation of the world that we find around us, within us and above us. Because the world is vast and great, there is room and there are levels of existence for all modes of constructive activity which, taken all together, explain the world of our experience such as it is. What is it a question of here? It is to affirm with as much clarity as possible the thesis that the doctrine of creation ex nihilo is the highest possible expression of magic, namely divine and cosmic magic. But if you ask me, dear unknown friend, if I believe that the creation of the world is only a magical act, without something preceding and without something following it, I reply to you, no, I do not believe this. A mystical act and a Gnostic act precede in eternity the act of creation as a magical act. This is followed by the activity of formation by the demiurge, or the demiurgic hierarchies, who undertake the work of craftsmanship, work which is essentially that of executive or hermetic philosophical intelligence. The classical Kabbalah furnishes us with a marvelous example of the peace possible between apparently rival doctrines. In its doctrine of 10 Sephiroth, it reaches first the mystery of eternal mysticism, Ein Sof, the unlimited. Then it expounds the Gnostic doctrine of eternal emanations from the womb of the divine, which precede, in ordine cognoscendi, the act of creation. They are the ideas of God within God, which precede the creation, the latter being a conscious act and not impulsive or instinctive. Then it speaks of pure creation, or creation ex nihilo, the act of the magical projection of the ideas of the plan of creation, i.e. the Sephiroth. This creative magical act is followed, in ordine cognoscendi, always by the activity of formation in which the beings of the spiritual hierarchies participate, including man. It is in this way that, according to the Kabbalah, the world comes into being. that the world of facts or deeds known to us through experience becomes what it is. Now, Olam Ha'asya, the world of facts, is preceded by Olam Hayetzirah, the world of formation or the demiurgic world. This is the product of Olam HaBeria, the world of creation or the magical world, which is in turn the realization of Olam HaAtziluth, the world of emanations or the Gnostic world, inseparate and inseparable from God, who in his true essence is the mystery of supreme mysticism, Ein Sof, the unlimited. It is therefore possible, and for us there is no doubt about it, to reconcile the diverse doctrines concerning the creation. It is only necessary to put each of them in its proper place, or to apply each to the plane which is proper to it. The Kabbalah, through its doctrine of the Sephiroth, provides a wonderful proof that this is so. Pantheism is true for the world of emanations, Olam HaAtziluth, where there are only ideas, within God and inseparable from him. But theism is true when one leaves the domain of uncreated eternity to pass on to the creation, meaning the creation of the ancestors or archetypes of phenomena that we know through our experience. And demiurgism is true when we contemplate the world or plane of formation, or the evolution of beings with the aim of coming into conformity with their created prototypes. But leaving aside the worlds or planes of formation, creation, emanation, and divine mystical essence, one can confine oneself solely to the plane of facts. Then naturalism becomes true, within the limits of this plane taken in isolation. The establishing of the hierarchic order of these doctrines concerning the creation, which appear to be rival, has led us right into the domain of activity of the Hermetic philosophical sense, the sense of synthesis. This sense, corresponding to the second hay of the divine name YHVH, is essentially that of final summary or the vision of the whole. It differs from the Gnostic sense, which corresponds to the first hay of the divine name, in that it summarizes or gives the synthesis of the differentiated whole, whilst the Gnostic sense gives the reflection of the whole in its germinal state. The Gnostic sense produces the first synthesis, or the synthesis before analysis. The Hermetic philosophical sense, in contrast, produces the second synthesis, or the synthesis after analysis. The work which is accomplished by means of this sense is not entirely creative. Rather, it is demiurgic, a work of craftsmanship, where one carries out the forming of a given material with the aim of giving it the form of its final manifestation. Since one finds in the Emerald Table formulae summarizing the three parts of the philosophy of the whole world, and since these at the same time summarize the worlds of magical experience, Gnostic revelation, and mystical experience, we have given this sense the name Hermetic philosophical sense, i.e., the sense of synthesis of the three worlds or higher planes in a fourth world or plane. It is the sense of synthesis operating in the vertical of the superimposed planes, i.e., it is Hermetic. For Hermeticism is essentially the philosophy based on magic, Gnosis, and Mysticism, which aspires to the synthesis of the diverse planes of the macrocosm and microcosm. When one summarizes facts on a single plane, for example those of biology, one uses the scientific sense and not the Hermetic philosophical sense. The scientific sense, which is generally known and recognized, summarizes the fact of experience on a single plane in the horizontal. Hermeticism is not a science and will never be one. It can certainly make use of the sciences and their results, but by doing so it does not become a science. Non-Hermetic contemporary philosophy summarizes particular sciences with the aim of fulfilling the function of a science of sciences, and has this in common with Hermeticism. But in itself it differs from Hermeticism, which aspires to summarize experience in all planes, which varies according to the plane where the experience takes place. This is why we have chosen the term Hermetic philosophical to designate the fourth sense, the sense of synthesis. It goes without saying that the characterization of the four senses, whose collaboration is necessary for tradition to live and not to degenerate, is sketched here in a very incomplete manner. But the two following arcana, the Empress and the Emperor, are of a nature such as to give greater depth and more concrete content to what we are setting forth, especially concerning the magical sense and the Hermetic philosophical sense. For the third arcanum of the tarot, the Empress, is the arcanum of magic, and the fourth arcanum, the Emperor, is that of Hermetic philosophy.